fantastic.
A very warm good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. This is, of course, another, session, another time to connect. And unfortunately, the last of 4 webinar series that will be focusing on mental health. But of course, and today we'll be having a special focus on emotional intelligence, this for personal growth as well as leadership. And I know that during this time of COVID-19, which is a global pandemic, we could all use, of course, some skills, emotional intelligence, to better grow ourselves, to, grow our family members, to better improve, at work, in our workplaces, to support our loved ones. So I think this is quite an imperative, conversation that we will be having. Now, I'll be introducing our panelists in just a moment, but I just want to give you a synopsis of, the reason and vision behind why we've had, this webinar and also the past 3 webinars alongside the Motsepe Foundation, as well as the Center for Gender Equality and Leadership. This is, of course, to ensure the well-being of all South Africans. Mental health interventions are necessary for improving the overall health and security of affected people. And I'm sure you can agree with me that is vital for national growth as well as development. So without any further ado, before we get into the gist of our conversation, I'd just like to welcome Dr. Precious Motsepe to the conversation to give us a warm welcome before we start. Dr. P.
Thank you so much, Dumelo, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm really excited to welcome you to our 4th and final webinar on mental health. When we started these webinars just after lockdown, it was because we realized that with the coronavirus pandemic and the resultant job cuts, being stuck at home, away from school, away from work, and people not knowing exactly how long this lockdown was going to be, or if they were going to get infected with coronavirus or not, we realized that there will be a lot of mental health challenges for people in the workplace, our nursing and healthcare workers, our students who are sitting at home as well. And that's why we decided to convene these mental health webinars. I think the last few sessions that we've had were very well received. We received a lot of advice, tools, coping strategies from the various panel members, from the gender advisory councils to the church leaders. And one of our panel members is going to give us a good wrap up on how that went down. I'm excited again today to have Dr. D, who is our psychologist and has been absolutely amazing in the last few sessions. And I'm more excited also to have activists and a chairperson, a corporate giant, who's authored a fantastic book on boardroom dancing, to come and talk to us about coping strategies at work and how we can apply emotional intelligence to cope with the challenges that we face in our daily lives. So let me welcome all our audience members, and I really hope that you will participate, ask questions to our panel members, and learn how you can actually cope with the current challenges and changes that we're facing. So Dumelo, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. P, for welcoming us and also that introduction. And with that being said, indeed, I am Dumelo Mototwane. I'll be a facilitator for this afternoon. I am a news and current affairs anchor with ENCA, and I look forward to just engaging with, experts in this field, but also engaging with you at home, wherever you are at work, listening in, watching. I can see, of course, some have already sent through their questions. Please continue to do so, because we will be, of course, affording you an opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. I'll just like to also ask you that if you have a specific question directed to a panelist, you may do so by just directing that question to either, Dr. D, to Dr. Stembile, or also Nenita. But before I do introduce our panelists, Dr. Stembile, I can see that according to my screen that your audio is not on. If you could just kindly, while we're in this phase of introductions, just amend your audio so that when it's time to have a conversation, then we can hear you. I think it's actually off now, so it means that we are all on board. All right, so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists, for this afternoon. We are joined by Dr. Dorian Carwell, also known as Dr. D. She is, of course, a CEO of Cara Consultants, certified facilitator, Young Presidents Organization. She's also a senior clinical psychologist, and I look forward to engaging with you, Dr. D, on some of the various issues and topics around emotional intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And also Dr. Stembile Mbete, a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. We understand, Dr. Stembile, you lecture international relations and South African politics, but you also had the privilege of facilitating the past webinar, so you've got some insight, on some issues around mental health that you'll be sharing with us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Stembile. It's good to have you. Also joining us, we are joined by Usis Nenita Fakude. She's the chairman at Anglo-American South Africa Management Board. But also, Usis Nenita, I'm looking forward to the insights that you'll have for us around emotional intelligence as well as mental health within the workplace. So thank you so much, Usis Nenita, for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, with that being said, for everyone joining us, just to give you as well as, a background, as Dr. P has just mentioned before, that businesses and individuals, I mean, I think we can all agree that we're all reaching a stage where we are accepting, recognizing, as well the need to adapt and survive, but also to thrive under these very difficult situations, this under COVID-19. And there's certain skills and capacities that may need to be developed, right? As well as understood and practiced that will assist with life's journey in general, as well as navigating, of course, this uncertain landscape in particular. So I wanted to start off this conversation then with you, Dr. Stembile, just, I suppose, consolidating, some of the issues that were raised at the previous webinars around mental health within our community. What came out of those, conversations?
I think one of the major things that came out, if I think of the first conversation that we had on mental health, and particularly in relation to healthcare workers, was about, and I think it was Dr. D who started us off by expressing the normality of the feelings of anxiety, of stress, of tension that many people were feeling at the time. I think our first conversation was during the hard lockdown, and a real sense of being shaken was something that everybody had been speaking about and expressing. And one of the things that Dr. D made very clear to us all was how normal that is, because we were facing, and we are still facing, such a all-encompassing crisis, right? It's not just a health crisis, but it's an economic crisis. We are seeing a lot of social consequences of the strain that people are under during this time. And so that for me was one of the big takeaways from that. And then the second thing was also, and this then followed through with all of the conversations that we had, was how hungry people are to talk about mental health. In our societies, we often don't talk so much about how we're feeling, about how we are feeling mentally. And so there was a great deal of engagement, and in some ways, I think, kind of relief from many of the people that joined the conversation with us to say, well, it's really nice to be able to talk about what's worrying me, but also to know that what I'm feeling is normal. That right. What I'm feeling, that I'm not some messed up crazy person, but that it is actually completely normal to be feeling this anxiety. So that certainly, to me, I think, was the biggest takeaway from this series in general, from the first three conversations that we had.
And just speaking to also diverse of experts, Dr. Stembile, they've often highlighted that this could be quite a lonely time for anyone that is dealing with mental health or mental, illness. I mean, you are alone. And I constantly see this messaging in media, hashtag alone together, to say we recognize that we have to be isolated. We have to be alone. We have to quarantine. But we're in this together. Hence, I think platforms as these are quite important to have, so that you know that, oh, I'm not the only one. I'm going through something like this. So Dr. D, then in layman's terms, please help us then understand, I mean, how can we then recognize, elements of emotional intelligence in others as well as in ourselves?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Absolutely, they are normal reactions to a very traumatic situation. What makes this situation different is the uncertainty and the unpredictability. And that is the differentiating thing, that we don't know exactly what we're dealing with. We don't know how long it's going to last. And the other part of it is that you can get sick, which is the one factor that is really different from the other, a lot of the other challenges that we've had. So, you can say that these feelings are normal, but your question and what we're talking about is fine. It may be normal. Does it help to say, everyone's got this, it's normal? Or how can we begin to deal with these feelings, even if we know that they're common? So that's what we're going to talk about certain personal and interactive skills under the whole umbrella of emotional intelligence. And just to start with, we always used to say, don't let your emotions cloud your judgment, get your emotions out of the way. You can't make clear decisions. You're not going to cope if you're too emotional. And I'd like to just say that that's the old thinking. The new thinking is very different. It's recognize your emotions, what triggers them and why, and learn how to deal with them intelligently. So it's the integration of head and heart, of rational and emotional together. It's not privileging the one or the other. So we can certainly explore some of the skills that fall under that umbrella. And just to quote the doyen, really, of one of the main writers of emotional intelligence, he says that if your emotional abilities are not in hand, if you don't have self-awareness, if you're not able to manage your distressing emotions, if you can't have empathy and have effective relationships, then no matter how smart you are or how much skill you have, you're not going to be able to get very far.
That is so important. And to be quite honest with you, Dr. D, I think emotional intelligence is something that I personally took for granted until, this very difficult time of a pandemic, where you realize that reality is here. We're going through a crisis. We're going through a pandemic. As a news anchor, dealing with statistics and numbers every single day, having to give those, stats to the rest of the country, but also being very objective, non-biased, and also giving a bit of hope to South Africans to say, we will come out of this. All of that encompasses emotional intelligence. And I suppose for many South Africans, it's a skill that we've all had to learn to adapt with right now and realize that we need to be strong for ourselves as well as for each other. And then, Sis Nenita, then just coming to you then, how valued are traits of emotional intelligence then within the workplace, do you think? Because with Dr. D, we spoke more on a personal perspective, but when it comes to the workplace, how valued is emotional intelligence?
Well, Tumelo, I can say, just based even on Dr. D's remarks just now, that within the private space and the business place, emotional intelligence is key, because people have got technical skills that they bring to the table. So the IQ is there, you've got the qualifications, but the difference that will make whether you make it as a leader or not often rests around your emotional intelligence and your ability to be able to see things broadly and be self-aware in terms of your own behavior and how it impacts on other people. And also at the same time, being able to use the data and the information you have in a mature way that will make sure that you make the right decisions long and also short term.
Right. And then I want to bring it back to you as well, Dr. Stimula, because I understand that these are some of the discussions that came out, right, in the previous webinar that you had. And I think we don't often think about the mental health of health workers. These are the frontline health workers that have to use the emotional intelligence, have to go into a room and either bring good news or bring bad news while protecting themselves from COVID-19, from the virus as well. And we rely on them so much for, their IQ, but also their comfort. I know my mom often says that when you walk into a doctor's room, you need to feel the healing before they even diagnose you or give you your result. And I suppose that's a responsibility that we place on health workers, that you want to feel that sense of comfort when you see them or when they come into contact with you. So can you then just tell us a bit about the outcomes around that discussion that you've had?
Certainly, the mental health of health workers is something that's really been neglected, I think, even pre-COVID. But its importance has really come up during the COVID crisis, because, as you say, health workers, we need them not only for their intellectual skills, but they're also an important point of support, and particularly with the COVID crisis, where people who are hospitalized aren't able to see their families. And so it's health workers that so the nurses and the doctors become the link between the COVID patients and their families, and are often the only people that are with a COVID patient when that patient dies, because the family isn't allowed to be in the hospital with them. And what that has done is that it's placed a great burden on healthcare workers to not only conduct their technical work, which is what the skilled work that they have to do, but also to play this counseling role, to play this nurturing role over and above that. And one of the things that came through very strongly in the conversation that we had about health workers was about how little support there actually was officially for health workers to support their mental health. So there was very little structural support that was coming from the state, and there were few organizations who were providing support in other ways. And so Dr. Zingela, Professor Zingela from Walter Sisulu University, but also Dr. Letlape, spoke quite extensively about what the initiatives were to provide support for healthcare workers, mental health support, but also to provide kind of basic workplace support in order to make sure that the rights of healthcare workers were being protected. But going back to what Dr. D said, what came through very strongly was the importance of solidarity, of community in supporting the mental health of health workers.
Right. I mean, certain coping mechanisms here are required, I can imagine, for health workers, but not only them, but also the greater society of South Africa. And I suppose not only now during COVID-19, but in life in general, there are coping mechanisms that we use. But Dr. D, I need you to assist us here, because sometimes we use coping mechanisms that may not necessarily be effective. Right? So then what coping mechanisms do you think are widely used that have proven to be, less effective and are rather detrimental to one's personal growth?
Thank you for that question. And also, just for unpacking the challenges of those healthcare workers, because I want to acknowledge how much I learned right at the beginning of this, of the lockdown. In working with healthcare workers, they were such an insight into what all of us were going through and what all of us really needed, except in certain ways it was harder for them. So when we're talking about the importance of coping mechanisms, like self-awareness and recognizing your feelings and how to cope with them, they had a huge problem because they had to also be doctors and have all of the answers and be in control. They didn't have the same permission to be a member of the human race like most of us were. So the challenges that they were having were exacerbated by their purpose and their need to be a doctor. You spoke about the fact that they needed to connect. Well, we were seeing that need to connect for all of us. But for them, it was even more of a challenge because some of them had to self-isolate and they were not coming home to families. So many of the things that we are dealing with frontline healthcare workers were a reflection of what we all needed, but perhaps even more so. So your question about what do we do usually, there are quite a lot of interesting things. It wasn't only, I mean, once you say coping mechanisms and then you say, well, they don't really work, then by implication, they weren't really coping mechanisms. They were attempts, they were desperate attempts to try and get on top of this that didn't work. So in the beginning, there was denial, for instance, denial of the seriousness of this and saying, look, it's just a sprint. We know now that it's a marathon. 21 days of lockdown, sure, we can do it. It's just like the flu. You know, it's not really so serious. So we attempt to cope and protect ourselves by denial. We also attempt to cope, and Nenita will agree that particularly in the workplace situation with leaders, the way they attempt to cope is to douse it down and to say, look, you know, I won't necessarily be affected by these feelings. I'll have a better day tomorrow. So it's not facing up to the feelings and what triggered them, which, you know, I've said before, if you don't own the story, you can't define the ending. So there was a way of wanting to push everything under the carpet in the beginning. And now I think eventually, as you have said, the stigma of mental health, that's been something that's been incredibly positive through this, because there is so much more talk about it. It's given people permission to say there is also a mental health pandemic. You know, it's not only a viral pandemic. So to the permission to recognize your feelings, which we weren't doing it all for. And then traditionally, and I know that you are interested in this, Tumelo, we used to always emphasize certain skills that we thought in our mind related to success. Success being how powerful are you, how successful have you been, maybe how much money have you made, what status do you have? And the skills that were associated with that usually were cognitive skills. How smart are you? How much skill set did you have? What was your IQ? And yet, what we know is that IQ only predicts 6% of job success. It's never, ever been a predictor of life success. It peaks at the teens, it's static. It may predict school grades relatively well, and it certainly can open lots of doors for you. But you may not stay in the door. And sometimes when I speak to people about this, they say, you know, you're absolutely right. The one who got the 7, 8, 9 distinctions in matric, where are they now? Are they the ones that really made it? So what we recognize now is I do not want to de-emphasize the importance of that. I certainly hope that my children aren't listening to this, because I want them to go to college and to get their education. It gives them their advantage. But if we look at some of the top people like Bill Gates or like Richard Branson or Mark Zuckerberg, or the ones whose name appear at the top, often they were college dropouts. What are the skills that are much more related to overall success, not only success in the way that I've described it, but fulfillment and happiness as well?
Right.
What are those coping skills? And we can unpack what those skills are. So there's been a bit of a wrong emphasis, I think. And now with this huge crisis, we're saying, okay, we're looking at other things that are prioritizing, that we need to prioritize. So that's why this conversation is so timeless and so important. Yeah,
it's so important, and I'm sure for everyone as well, you know, listening in and watching from home may relate to this. They may relate to this conversation, and I would like to appeal to you to please continue, you know, sharing in your questions. If you have a personal, you know, story that you want to relay this to alongside your question, please do so, and then we'll definitely ask our panelists to just share how you can cope better from where you're standing within your situation. But it's just not a time, I mean, bearing in mind what Dr. D and then Dr. Tembile had just said, I mean, you are an author of a very, you know, successful book named Boardroom Dancing. So then I want to know, I'm very curious to know, what then is the role of a board or the board, during this pandemic? And have you perhaps seen how boards are responding to COVID-19? And if so, what can you share with us?
So, Tumelo, for years, companies have always had employee assistance programs, or EAP, where you can call in a toll-free line to talk to someone, so that your personal issues don't actually affect your work outputs. And more often than not, those calls that you would make would be either you are in financial distress, so you need someone to help you with debt counseling, or you've got personal issues at home and you need someone to talk to. And also it could be just general family issues. And that EAP program has always been about giving an employee a safe space to talk to outside of work, because again, you don't want the perception or the stigma that you are not coping. So that has been the old paradigm. However, with the COVID-19, we all realize that this issue is not just only about the health issues, but it's also about making sure that business continues to thrive and we therefore safeguard livelihoods. And many boards, the first question that they are asking is, are we sure that our employees are safe, are healthy, and are well taken care of? And that has led us to go back to those service providers and ask them to even expand the kind of program or support that they would ordinarily give, because nowadays, under the lockdown, you also have the gender-based violence issues that are quite concerning. And also, you know that for your employees, for them to be productive without looking someone in the eye every day, you've got to do things differently. So boards have asked the questions, how are the people doing? Secondly, the boards are also asking, what resources do we need to give to the company and to the community to support and alleviate the possible impacts that would come as a result of COVID? And also a lot of collaboration and partnerships have taken place with other businesses, with other like-minded organizations, and more importantly, with government. And the boards and leaders today will tell you that one of the key issues is around how we engage with all those stakeholders in a way that will make sure that people understand that we still want to balance the issue of protecting health and lives of people, whilst at the same time safeguarding the future in terms of the livelihoods. And so for the boards, making sure that there is a program first to support the employees is important. And secondly, making sure that even from a community involvement perspective, the fact that Corporate South Africa, for instance, has come across and set up the Solidarity Fund, including the Motsepe Foundation funds, that has been also the response of corporates in the country saying we need to do something more than what we would ordinarily have done before to make sure that the resources that we have are shared equally as far as is possible with communities and other people.
Absolutely. And these efforts are to ensure emotional intelligence for personal growth as well as, for leadership versus Nenita, because, people are going through a lot. It's disheartening to read reports about South Africans who have lost loved ones, number one. Some are breadwinners, some are spouses, but also knowing that even burying a loved one has become so difficult. You cannot be in contact with a loved one who has passed on due to COVID-19. The burial rites that maybe you practice, may not necessarily be, observed at that time. Some have lost their jobs. Some, have gotten salary cuts. So the role of the board there and the leadership within a company is so important. So you feel that you are within a community of employers who definitely still, want to secure the future while also showing you support. And then Dr. Simbile, then bringing it back to you, I know that this was part of the conversation that you had, particularly on the second webinar. I mean, different perspectives here of mental health that were discussed. We're talking gender, we're talking cultural, as well as religious perspectives. How did that conversation go?
One of the important things that came out of that conversation, as far as the cultural aspects go, and what you're describing about needing to change our customs, right? So my family in the Eastern Cape, for example, is having to deal with needing to cremate because the government has said that, that we just won't be able to bury everybody. And so what came through very strongly is about thinking about healing and about health in a multifaceted way, that it's not just about our physical body or the physical illness that people are experiencing, but also about spiritual, how settled people are spiritually, mentally. And that was what was great about that conversation, is that we were able to have, to go into depth about all of those different facets of us as human beings, and how we can be unwell in our spiritual lives or in our mental lives, even if we seem to be okay physically. And so when we think of the COVID-19 as a multifaceted health crisis, how do we then draw on both cultural and religious practices to provide the necessary support for people's mental health, for them also to be able to navigate the physical illness that everybody is being threatened by and is having to deal with. I think the other thing that came through then was around the very important issues, the gender dimensions of mental health. And Ms. Nenita has spoken about the gender-based violence that we're seeing and how that's increased, and there were a lot of men who in the comments and in the Q&A were speaking about the difficulties that men are having in terms of both accessing help for their mental health, but also in terms of knowing, having the strategies to be able to deal with the stresses that they face in a context of losing jobs, facing financial strain, but also that we have this macho culture that says that, you don't talk about your feelings, you don't talk about your problems. And so where do they find a safe space to be able to engage in that way? And having seen the big increase in gender-based violence over the last few weeks, I think that aspect of that conversation has become ever more important, and something that we need to keep thinking about into the future.
Indeed. With that being said, then I just want to open up the floor, to just questions that we're receiving right now, because they're coming up. There's so many, and I don't want to waste any further time. But I just want to involve, everyone into this conversation. So I'm going to get some questions that I have received. These are just some pre-questions that we have received so far. And I want to start off perhaps with this one. I don't know, maybe I can start with this one and direct it to you, Dr. D. The question says, in the context of COVID, can we have more online social conversations for women as work and home demands have become blended into a new normal? So there seems to be a need then for more online, conversations. How can we identify these safe spaces, do you think?
Look, I think that she has asked, thank you, that's such an important question, because one of the, when I listen to Nenita talking, in my mind, there was a huge word that just kept coming up over and over again. And we might say that it's emotional intelligence, but also it's business strategy. It's exactly the same thing in my mind. She was talking about the importance of acknowledgement of people, their practical needs and what they need for safety and what they need for security. She was also talking about the emotional needs, recognizing what they're feeling like and offering that kind of acknowledgement. And why I say it's a business strategy, not because it's a deliberate way But people who feel good about themselves produce better results. And people who feel acknowledged and recognized in their businesses or whatever produce better results. So it's about feeling connected and important. And this is also relates to the question. One of the emotional intelligence groups, there are 5, and the second one that we always talk about is about interpersonal skills and the importance for empathy and for connection, where you can talk to people who will listen to understand in a very specific way. What are you going through? They're not necessarily there to respond in terms of, oh, my situation is better or worse or whatever. I need to be there to connect to you. And that's why I prefer, if possible, to talk about physical distancing instead of social distancing. Let's see if we can have social connection still, as our person is asking, even in physical distance. So we know the best thing for emotional connection and literacy and for creating rapport is obviously face-to-face, where you can touch someone which has something. But you can also connect. Voice is very important and visual is very important. So if you can do it in the way we're doing it, it's sort of the next best thing. And these days people say, don't leave a message, leave a text. What they're leaving out is the power of the voice, the tone of voice, which is also important for connection. You know, that kind of text are important for content, but it's not so important for contact. So if we want to make the connection, I think that you don't wait for people to reach out to you. You know, oh, it's their turn. You know, maybe they don't want to speak to me or whatever. People usually respond in a far better way. And they understand that by giving you something, in terms of connection, they're getting something as well. They then feel that they are valued. And they feel empowered because they're giving something in terms of support, conversation, interest, acknowledgement to other people. So the line between giving and receiving becomes quite blurred. And it's really, really important to understand the healing power of support. And just to say that that is scientific. We know that people who are in more supportive relationships actually get sick less often and get better more quickly. So there's a hormone called oxytocin that gets released in the face of that kind of acknowledgement and connection, which actually helps protect your immune system well. So connection is good for your health as well.
That's so true. We need human contact. I think everyone appreciates human contact more than ever now that, you know, most people are isolated and even working from home. All right, we still have a couple of more questions to go through, and I just want to encourage everyone to please send them through. This is your opportunity to have any question that you have to be answered by our panelists, and just an appeal to our panelists to also just answer as brief as you can so that we can get through as many of our questions as possible.
Sorry.
So, no, it's okay. So, to you, Sis Nolita, I think this one is perfect for you. It's from Reverend Nongaba Musungudu. And they say, thank you so much for this excellent topic. The question is, are there any measures taken to psychologically reassure those who are over 60 years of age and are currently unable to go out and do contract work as before? The COVID-19 impact has definitely affected us all, more especially if we no longer get any form of income, and worse if you do not even qualify to get SASSA or any form of financial relief. It is even worse when one had just been widowed. It's painful indeed, it's quite traumatic. So there, Sis Nolita, we're seeing, you know, a question around, you know, the elderly citizens that have been requested to either stay at home or work from home, so that contact being limited there.
So you know, I'm so pleased that that question came up, because one of the big challenges we are facing today in business is the whole issue of saying people must self-identify as having pre-existing comorbidities in terms of whatever they are sick about. And most of the time, people would not have shared that information with their line manager, because they didn't have to. And now in this situation, we are saying, if you've got pre-existing conditions, please don't come to work because we don't want you to be exposed. So it's not only the age issue, it's also the health status issue. And also it's the situation around who do you stay with. You could be younger, but living with elderly parents. And therefore, if you catch something out there, you bring it back home. And those are some of the processes that are forcing us in business to say, let's be transparent, let's help people understand that it's fine to talk to your manager for confidentiality, and also overemphasize the issue around disclosure, personal disclosure, because it's for the benefit of everyone. And what we've also seen is that as we even start talking about contact tracing of people who have been exposed to somebody else, it starts opening up the whole issue of, who else were you in contact with in the last 14 days? Now you're really going deeper into people's private lives outside of work. And so companies are putting in additional support, psychologists, and also other health professionals to help people work through this process. So it's a period where everyone is being open, is being vulnerable, and we need to start doing that as leaders. The other issue is the check-in process. As we work remotely, because we're not seeing each other all the time, the productivity of people working from home differs from one situation to the other, and where people feel that their work day cannot be structured in such a way that they can have access to technology because their child is studying, because they are not at school. We're finding that we talk about it and say, let people look at the output rather than the input. And it's a mindset change that we all are going to have to embrace, where we're saying we don't have to see you at work every day, but we will see the outputs of your work, even though you're not at work. And so I would say the issues around who is vulnerable, who is in terms of this virus, I think everybody, one way or the other, has got their vulnerabilities. And what's important for us as leaders is to help people understand that it's okay to talk about those vulnerabilities, and also how you feel your situation is going on. And lastly, because I know I'm long, most people are also having weekly check-ins with the team, so that you connect remotely to find out how was your weekend, is everybody okay, what's on your mind, and is there anything we can support you with just morally for this week. Because with technology, the emails come 24/7, the phone doesn't stop ringing, and you need as a person to find a way of managing around it whilst being productive and professional, and at the same time being anchored as a person during this period.
And speaking of ways to cope and manage with what we're all dealing with, Nenita, it's important to just also share helpful information with our audiences around organizations that are working tirelessly around the clock, 24 hours. They're ready to take your call should you need someone to speak to. Organizations such as SADC, they're readily available. You can go to their website, www.sadc.org. You can call them, you can SMS them. Their line is 31393. That's their SMS line. Whenever you feel the pressure coming in and you feel that it will definitely interrupt your daily life as well as your work, environment, they are ready to give you that, support as we continue to have this conversation. But also, Dr. Stembile, we had this discussion about health workers and around the immense pressure that they also go through. And I see a brilliant question here coming from Cecil Budibe, who asks, who heals the healers? Mental health professionals themselves. Who heals them? Because they work around the clock. Yes, they may be doing that shift, when they come into work, but also while they're at home, I can imagine inundated with emails, pages, SMSs about patients walking in and out of the hospital. And we know that immense pressure, coming in for healthcare workers to constantly avail themselves. But Cecil is asking there, who then heals the healer?
Well, this is it's a big question and sort of the $1 million question. And certainly what's come through from the conversations that we've been having with the Motsepe Foundation is that there are organizations, SADAG, also CSVR, the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, have joined together with other organizations to provide mental health helplines and support for healthcare workers, so people that healthcare workers can call to say, look, I'm struggling with this. I think though the other point is, and that came through very strongly from Dr. Letlape, was about the need for there to be the proper structural support. So what are the policies for when a healthcare worker gets sick with COVID? You know, what are the policies about how they look after their families? About, you know, do they get access to medical care that comes from their employer? We saw recently a report being released by Oxfam South Africa about the very terrible work conditions of nurses and community health workers. We know that one of the things that the World Health Organization has praised about South Africa's COVID response is how we're using community health workers for contact tracing and for testing. But those people are working under terrible conditions of not having sufficient PPE, of not having any mental health support, and of being underpaid. So I think that what comes through very strongly here, and I think this might be also a point to Reverend Musonkotu's question, is that we can't think of addressing mental health on its own without also dealing with some of the underlying structural problems that exacerbate people's mental health conditions. And so how can we create a workplace that is fully supportive to mental health professionals?
Right.
And to, yeah.
And I mean, we place the focus then on, you know, workers, but also there are students, and you work with students as well. You are a lecturer as well. How does it apply there when it comes to, you know, students and institutions of higher learning?
Certainly. So one of the things that institutions of higher learning realized that we had to do very quickly was to address the structural situation that our students live under. So do they have laptops? Do they have internet access? And we realized that we couldn't deal with the educational aspects of remote learning without addressing those very basic structural things about, do they have material to learn with? And then once we had done that, universities have now also invested a great deal into moving healthcare services online, so students can get access to a therapist, to a counselor, online or on the phone or on WhatsApp, to be able to talk through some of those struggles. And I think this has become particularly important as we've seen that this is going to be a protracted crisis, right? That we all sort of thought we'll be off campus for 2 or 3 months and then we'll all be back. But it's very clear that that won't be the case. And so we've provided that support for students. And another very important aspect has been about providing that support for academics, because now the lecturing staff is, you know, you're at home, you're working from home, dealing with all of your care responsibilities, but also needing to teach online. And so that's also been a challenge that universities and all the different institutions have been working around. And what came through clearly from the conversation was how, because these are things that individual universities are doing, there is too little of a sector-wide approach that would assist everybody in the system. And then just lastly, I think that the other workers that we need to think about a lot when we talk about universities is the essential workers at universities, the cleaners, the security guards, who have been going to work during the lockdown, and what kind of support have institutions made available to those people, also for their mental health, but also in terms of their conditions of employment.
Absolutely. And I can imagine being, you know, part of a lecturing staff where you have to give off your best to students, ensure that they grasp the concept as best as possible, while also managing everything else that you are dealing with that has to do with your mental health. It could be quite challenging. So that support, Dr. Stembile, is quite important. And just speaking of that, Dr. D, I mean, we had initially spoken about less effective coping mechanisms, but I see Sfiso Ngomonde has asked a question just for you to please confirm and clarify then what the coping mechanisms are that should be used and can be used, please?
Okay, that's really the question, and what I want to say in up to now is that honestly, can I say that I believe that there's a thread of similarity of being human, of being people, irrespective of what you do. You may be a student or you may be a healthcare worker. Some of those external challenges may be very different, or you may be a mother in lockdown, or you may be a leader, or whatever. But some of these coping mechanisms that fall under emotional intelligence, some might be emphasized differently, but they're the same. So when I listen, I want to say to self, take care of yourself. In the beginning, when I look at how I was doing one Zoom thing with no break after the other, we talk about self-compassion in order to be effective and in order to give to someone else. What does self-compassion mean? It means on the physical side. It means sleep, it means exercise, it means nutrition, the things that we hear about all the time. It means emotional care. So if you've got huge issues that are unresolved, that's going to affect it as well. So the aspects of and how do you stop, whether you an elderly person or whether you a healthcare worker or whatever, the mind tends sometimes to catastrophize. So we need to look at facts, what are the real, because we go on like, what if this, what if that, what if I get sick? How do you stay in the present? How do you do a reality check of what's in your head and what the real facts are? Do we know that if we employ these safety strategies, like simple things like washing your hands or wearing a mask or gloves, we actually are doing something for self-protection? Mm-hmm. So the coping mechanisms under the group of emotional intelligence, there are intrapersonal coping mechanisms. That means, how do you understand your become self-aware? Do you know what you're feeling like? And then afterwards, how do you control those feelings? And it seems to me, Lord, that it's such a simple question. Of course, I know if I'm sad or if I'm mad or if I'm glad or if I'm scared or if I'm surprised. Those are the facts. But you actually sometimes don't. You spoke about the difference in gender. For men, it's hard to be scared or sad because they see it as vulnerable and it often appears to them to be too weak. So when the real issue is to be hurt or to be frightened, sometimes it gets manifest as anger. And then there's a kind of an acting out. And so the real issue is never really dealt with properly. For women are reared more to look after other people more, and they often leave themselves out, to be nurturers or caregivers. So to be able to be assertive while still, look, I need some time out. Please, will you help me? I'm not coping with this too well. Isn't they kind of, no, I'm being so generalist here, but more, there are different gender ways. So there is the recognition of feelings, how to deal with them by honoring the other person and your own needs, how to do reality checks, what is in your head and what is real. All of those skills are non-cognitive. They fall under the umbrella of emotional intelligence. Then the interpersonal skills, how do you connect with other people? We've spoken about that a lot. Then there are the skills of adaptation and flexibility. Boy, do we need those now. How do we have the flexibility of emotion, thought, and behavior that fits into new situations? Can we be flexible and think laterally? Because the plans that we've made are all falling apart now. And people get very upset if all of their planning or their routine or feeling of being out of control. So there are skills. There are skills that we can do that says, how do I roll with the punches? How do I remember coping skills that I've used before that I can mobilize now to bounce back, to be a little bit more flexible? How can I reach out to other people? And then there's all of the group of skills to Melo and to our audience that fall under stress management. How do we start managing the stress? And a lot of people don't see the difference between distress and what we call eustress. So eustress is like positive stress. Life changes is up
You
and down.
can hear me, Sister, to try and just address the all right, I think we have you now. Sorry there, I think we have lost you. We had lost you there, but I think we got the gist of also what you were saying, and just in terms of how to manage those coping mechanisms, Dr. D. And with that being said, then I want to bring it to you, Sister Nenita, just in terms of gender. Does the fact that women are more in touch with emotions, so perceived to be more in touch with their emotions, make them better at managing, through crisis? How do then men leaders learn emotional intelligence, or do we see emotional intelligence in men as well?
Well, I think the perception that only women have got the emotional intelligence that comes to being sensitive and nurturing is something that is being busted. It's changing, because the more we talk openly about employee and well-being and mental health, the more people feel comfortable and confident to talk about their feelings. And again, the leaders that we have, who unfortunately are not mostly women, are men, are also learning, beginning to ask the question in terms of how are you doing? And you turn it around to them and you say, how are you doing? How are your people doing? So there is coaching, obviously, that is required for some men to go through in terms of helping them get in touch with their own feelings, but also more importantly, allow others to show their feelings. Because at work, people tend to say, you shouldn't show your feelings. So role modeling is very important. And in my experience, it's been the white male who were my bosses, and also the black males, when they open up and start being more human, that and allow themselves to be vulnerable and talk. And it could be talking about how's your family, how are you doing. Those small things make a huge difference, because you are actually allowing people in the organization to talk openly about their feelings. One of the key competencies of the future, and the future is today now, it's no longer 10 years ago, future is today, whether it's fourth industrial revolution, that's today, is around empathy. And that empathy is about being able to listen to other people and listen with understanding and empathy, and also to be able to allow yourself to tell your own story. A lot of the leaders, when they start by opening up and saying, wow, that was a tough day, that's your opening. So we need to have more of these conversations and reaching out to each other, and make sure that when people open up and talk about how they are feeling about the situation, that they find support rather than judgment.
Right. And speaking of the judgment, I'm so glad you speak about that, because, interestingly, the MEC of Health in the Western Cape yesterday, or 2 days ago or so, had mentioned on record in the media that they found within the province that more people did not want to test for COVID-19 because of fear of that judgment, because of fear of that stigma, because of fear of that, being isolated from the community, being told to stay away from, people's children or shops, because, community members were afraid of contracting COVID-19. So they preferred not to know their status at all, as opposed to knowing, having the knowledge and isolating, and then protecting everyone else around themselves to do the same. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Nenita, the issue of judgment which comes across. But also this question, Dr. Stembile, which I want to address to you as well, speaks into, a question around, judgment. This is from Terence Khatwayo, who says, how easy could it be for us as men to be able to express our emotions using social media without being labeled and bashed for it? And between the three men, which of course he lists below, who is most likely to be able to understand what emotional intelligence is and be able then to speak out and deny himself the trauma of suffering depression. So under these lists, which of the three men is most likely to understand emotional intelligence? Is it a man raised by a single female parent? Is it a man raised by both parents? Or is it an orphan? This is the question. And I'll direct it to you, and perhaps Dr. D, you can come in there after Dr. Stembele just to give your perspective, please.
Look, I would like to defer on the answer to that one to Dr. D, because she's a psychologist. She's trained on these issues. I don't have the professional expertise to answer on that question.
Dr. D?
Yeah, I think that we have preconceived ideas about what it means either to be an orphan or to be brought up with a single parent. And in our minds, that kind of whole traditional way of being brought up by both parents, we think is the best. Not only it is, it's only the best if the relationship between the parents was good, if the parents recognized their children's needs and responded to them well. So, any parent who does that in a sensitive way certainly can help fulfill the needs. That's not to say there isn't a deficit in any way of a role model, but one of the wonderful things about emotional intelligence is that, in a way, I'm being a little bit sort of frivolous, I suppose, and I don't mean to be, but I wanted to say, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. In other words, these skills that I'm talking about, we're talking about them now. Authentic vulnerability for connection. If you try doing that, I work with a lot of men, business leaders and CEOs and so on. Do you know that vulnerability and openness is more contagious than any virus? The minute you challenge your perception about someone who is successful and strong and tough, and they start saying, I don't always have the answers. I get scared sometimes. It's been tough, be in my relationship, being under lockdown. I'm worried about my child who isn't coping with the online learning. It gives others permission to say, oh, thank goodness, I'm talking to another human being, which gives me permission to do that as well. And then you start getting this connection through authentic vulnerability like that. And then once again, listening to what Nenita was saying, do you know that that's also, it's not meant to be, but it's a business strategy. Because when you have connected people in your business, don't you think they're going to collaborate better? I have developed trust. I understand you better now. I know a little bit about you. The quality of our collaboration, even in a business sense, is going to be on a different level from those kinds of conversations. So what I would say to our gentleman caller is, you don't have to spill out all over the place. Choose your tribe, someone who you think will show you understanding and who cares about you, and try it and see what happens, and you'll really be surprised.
And with that being said, because we were just speaking about gender, men and women, I want to bring it into more cultural perspective to you, Dr. Stembele, because you had that conversation, in the past webinar where we were looking at, the cultural narrative or perspective on the issues we're talking about today. And Anonymous here has asked a question, and they say, often when we talk about how, I suppose, we feel, how we really feel, we are told we're being disrespectful. How can we talk to our parents about how we really feel without coming across as disrespectful? Did that perhaps come out during your conversations, that cultural perspective on addressing parents when it comes to emotions and mental health?
It did, certainly. And one of the things that came out from when SADAG was on the panel was that many of the calls that SADAG was getting were from young people who are, you know, the biggest increase in calls that they've gotten during the lockdown period was from young people, many of whom are being stuck at home with parents and really struggling to navigate those tensions and the impact of it on their mental health. And that culturally, in terms of African traditions, you're expected to speak in a certain way to your parents. You don't tell your parents everything. And so it can feel really difficult to engage with them on these issues. And that's why my advice to the anonymous attendee would be to actually phone that SADAG mental health helpline and be able to speak honestly to somebody else, to a neutral person who doesn't know your family, who doesn't know who you are, and to be able to just get that, what your feelings are out, and then also to get from them a few strategies about how you can manage or navigate the tension in the situation in your household in a way that doesn't make things worse for you. And I think that, you know, part of the challenge is that because, as we've spoken about quite a lot, these conversations about mental health are new conversations in our communities and in our families. Our parents don't have the skills to know how to navigate those conversations and how to do it. And so you need to sort of let them in gently. And part of it often is to talk about how you feel, but in a non-accusatory way. So don't say you did this and you know, and you did this against me and now I am like this. Rather talk about, this is how I feel about the situation. When I experience this, this is how it impacts me.
Right.
And this is how I feel, and making it about your conversation, about your feelings, and making the conversation about you trying to get somebody else to understand, rather than it being a conflictual situation. That is the advice I would give about that.
Yeah, you're so right in saying that, you know, most of, you know, parents perhaps don't know how to do better because they come from that generations themselves. It's like a cycle, right? They were taught to get better results. You're harsher, don't listen, just instill discipline and authority and move. So perhaps you're right in saying that introduce that new way of communication within the household, but not being confrontational and using the same method, but indirectly, but instead saying, this is how I feel, this is how it makes me feel, how does it make you feel? And how can we sort of reach a compromise as a relationship so that we both move forward, but not place blame and point fingers. That could allow for growth, I suppose, within the household. All right, so I'm going to take the last round of just questions from our attendees, and then we're going to close up after this last round with just your closing remarks, and then hand back, you know, to Dr. P for her closing session and remarks. But with this last round, I want to bring it back to you, Sis Nolita. It seems the issue of alienation within the workplace keeps popping up. So this question, I think, is best suited for you to assist us with, please. It says, in the context of COVID, alienation and disconnection from work environments will have a negative reinforcement notion of us and them between bosses and workers, because we would then become strangers over time. And I suppose we address that with the senior citizens whom, you know, due to some of the lockdown regulations, the government had appealed that if you're over, you know, the age of 60 and above, kindly stay home because you are part of that vulnerable group that may easily contract COVID. But the concern here is, doesn't that create alienation in us and them, and a disconnect between workers, you know, as well as the employer and the work environment?
That is a very fair question, Tumelo, because again, different companies and organizations have got different cultures and different styles of working. So the fact that we are caught up either in a lockdown or in a situation where we do not interact on a daily basis, it's incumbent on leaders to do regular check-ins. And those check-ins, like I was saying earlier on, some people do it first thing on Monday, everyone connects on the phone or through Zoom, how are you, how was the weekend, and have the conversations, and others do it towards the end of the week. And over and above that, it's important that we continue to reach out to our colleagues. Just because I'm not seeing you now during lunch break and tea break doesn't mean that I shouldn't once in a while reach out to you. So we are encouraging that, and there have been webinars that most companies have been running for their staff to help them keep in touch with what's happening in the organization. Obviously, one of the biggest issues that's back of mind for most people is when we go back, how is it going to look like in terms of, is it business as usual?
Right.
Am I going to lose my job? There are all those anxieties that are there. And it's important that we recognize and acknowledge that those anxieties are there and they're valid, and continue to communicate and communicate and communicate with all of our people. And that I cannot overemphasize. And one of the ways to also make sure that it's a two-way process. A lot of the other companies do group webinars where people actually just come to talk and get a status update in terms of where are we as an organization. It just means we are now going to have to use all those soft skills that people used to say are soft, where you are talking to people, where you are finding out about their well-being, and also that you show a little bit of compassion and empathy and really truly understand where people are at. I'll give you a quick example. One of the other sessions we were having on a weekly basis with one of my teams, I only realized during the third week that the individual was the only one in our team who didn't have a private space to have these conversations. So they would go to the car and sit in the car and take their video conferencing for the team. And it's only when you start understanding those, and they won't say that to everybody, but when you probe and have that once a week or once a fortnight call to talk to people, check how things are happening, you will start finding out all those kind of issues. This technology actually has, in many respects, if you've got access to technology, it's got an equalizing effect, because we are all seeing each other at the same time, and there are no other noises around our conversation. I feel I'm talking to you now, whereas in a big boardroom, you still don't know what's happening around. So I'm looking at it more positively to say this is one equalizer, provided that obviously people have got access to the technology and the access to the internet and Wi-Fi and all those kind of issues, which is what business are looking towards, to make sure that the ways of working in the future are actually going to incorporate and integrate technology the way we are doing at the moment.
From what I'm hearing you say, Sis Nenita, I'm also hearing you say that, this time has also allowed for business or even employers to be more empathetic towards their employees, because sometimes you find quite stringent working environments where it's leave your problems at the door, come and be productive, and fetch your problems at the door and go home. But now when you make the example of, then we realize that one of our team members has to, work from a car because that's the only quiet space they have. And it allows for that understanding, more from, our work leaders and our employers, which is quite new, I have to say, I suppose, for some people as well, who haven't had, that side or seen that side from employers. But Dr. D, I want to come back to you on emotional intelligence, but this is quite a different example, but very relevant to what most South Africans are going through, at least parents are concerned. This question is from Precious Mamutibedi Mukwala, and they say, Dr. D, seeing that there's tension relating to children going back to school, on top of many other challenges, how can parents and or caregivers keep their emotional intelligence in check to ensure that their anxiety or even their stress does not negatively impact on their children? But they also ask another question. They say, secondly, more in general, how can then families with limited resources work together to promote emotional well-being of family members, because I'm seeing more verbal fights in households. Members have shorter tempers, increased alcohol use, and so forth. So what would you say to both questions, Dr. D?
They're very, very important, and they're difficult questions. It's a real reality of what we're dealing with absolutely at the moment. But the answer to it is to do with what we've been talking about quite a lot. And I think that is awareness is the first step to change. So if you are aware of what you're going through and you can understand your feelings, then you also know the importance of being able to share those feelings. Perhaps, well, let's start about the kids in the home. The reality is there's some anxiety. There's a virus out there. That is reality. What can you do? You have to weigh it up between the importance of them going back to school. Many want to go back to school, and keeping them safe. The recognition is that it's a dilemma that we're in. Maybe there are other parents that also have this dilemma, and the connection to be able to talk to these other parents also is very important. So I guess you have to make a decision and then say, if we've made a decision to encourage them to go back, how do we manage that decision in the best possible way? Can we talk to them about the importance of safety without their anxiety going over the roof? To say, look, you will be fine, but then you need to wear your mask in these situations. And you need to, so it's not going over the top, but it is also recognizing that we're in a very, very difficult situation. So I think talking to them honestly and in an age-appropriate way, and not feeling out of control with these realistic dilemmas and responses that you have. Once again, going back to what you said in the very, very beginning, they are expected normal reactions to a very traumatic situation. So perhaps it's to do with contact with other parents and what do we all think and how are we going to manage it. Honesty to do with your children in an age-appropriate manner. To say, look, this is what's happening now. Let's work together to make it work in the best possible way. And managing the process.
Right.
And then there was the second part of what you said about, was it being in lockdown, was it?
Yes, being in lockdown, seeing more tempers, short tempers, more alcohol consumption. For the well-being of the family, then how does emotional intelligence apply?
Look, it just applies hugely. There's so many different skills under the umbrella of emotional intelligence. I think being in that situation, someone said to me the other day, it's interesting. I said for better or for worse, but not for lunch. And now, now, this is it. And also then there was the alcohol ban and the lockdown and everything. So it's knowing that those feelings are going to be triggered. It's understanding that lack of space. Financial insecurity is a huge loss. Job insecurity. The loss of, there's so many losses. The loss of predictability, of certainty. So one of the, somebody from a company said, I've lost myself because I've had to do terrible things like cutting down people's salaries and so on. That's not who I am. I don't see myself like that. I've lost myself. So there's so many losses that are happening. And there you are. So what do you do? What do you do? You have to have a sense of personal entitlement. So it is important to say, when you get on a plane, they tell you that you put on your oxygen mask first before you help children and other people. If you are not filling yourself up and taking care of yourself, you can't be someone else's wife, someone else's partner, or someone else's mother or father. So it is a sense of personal entitlement. I need some space. I need some help. This is what I need. Trying to take care of yourself. And then task negotiation at home. Who is going to do what? The children are and people are in different roles now. Suddenly you used to go out to work and now you're a teacher.
Right.
Never signed up for that. But that's the role that you have to play. So have discussions of who is going to do what at what time. Those are the sort of practical things that can help, and being able to to have self-awareness, which is the first step to control of these feelings and stress.
So important. Thank you so much, Dr. D. This is the last question that I'll take from our attendees, and then we'll get closing comments. But I'll direct this one to you, Dr. Stembile, because this one speaks about platforms, and you have, just facilitated the past webinars. You've had an opportunity to get an inside view into some of the concerns that are raised by, South Africans when it comes to, mental health. So this one is from Dipulelo, and they give more of an input, but I would like your comments based on this input. Dipulelo says, this is more of an input, given COVID-19, there should be more sessions in government departments where women are empowered through knowledge, such as this particular session, including, amongst others, gender-based violence, leadership development programs, the impact that this difficult period is having on persons with disabilities as part of inclusion when addressing these kind of matters rather. So I suppose your comments are coming in on the importance of such platforms and such sessions and engagements, just so we can check in on one another.
Certainly, and I think that, in many ways, and people have joked about this on social media, but that for a lot of people that are actually working as civil servants, so people working in government, they have not had to work this hard, this intensely, and this systematically on an issue in a very long time. And I think that what this crisis has exposed is where the gaps in knowledge, in sensitivity, in awareness are. And I definitely think that something that needs to come from this period is for us to have a lot more consciousness about what is it that we need our government employees to know. About assisting people in general, and the mental health impact of their interventions. And I think, the point that Dipulelo has made is such an important one about the needs and the impact of this issue on people with disabilities. Because people with disabilities and globally are facing a hugely, have anxiety that's almost double what the rest of us have, because of the concerns around who gets treated with limited COVID resources. So if there is a choice in an ICU between, do you give the ventilator to somebody with disabilities or to somebody without, who gets prioritized over whom in that situation? Who gets access to what kind of medication? When you have when people aren't allowed to visit each other in their homes, and you are a disabled person, who is coming to assist you with the needs that you have? Bishop Mpumlwana, in the session that we had in the second for the second webinar, spoke a lot about how religious leaders and churches, even though at that point they weren't having services, were being roped on to assist people who were stuck at home because of disability. Right. In all sorts of ways. And so I think it's so important that Dipulelo has brought that up, and I think is something that's worth having further discussions for. But I do think that government departments are really realizing about how they need to address the varying nuances of their work, not just, filling in the forms for an ID document, for example.
Absolutely. Now, with that being said, I would like to thank everyone for sending through their questions, and I just want to get in last closing, remarks and comments from you. And so, Nenita, I want to start with you. Just parting shots here that we could use in our personal lives, we could use at home for leaders to consider. And before I ask you this question, I think all of us witnessed that, dehumanizing video that went viral on social media of, that man in Khayelitsha who was, of course, evicted from his shack naked, and his shack in this demolished. It made the headlines, and I use that because I think in as much as we want to apply emotional intelligence on our lives within the workplace as employees, we need to also appeal to our leaders to use that emotional intelligence. But this is just one example. With that being said, how do you then advise for any leader right now watching, listening in, how would you advise them to use emotional intelligence for their own personal growth, but also for their organizational growth and for the betterment of their communities with which they serve?
You know, Tumelo, the example that you've just given about the incident in Cape Town, which is devastating that we still have situations like that in our country, evictions in winter and all the related complications. My view, and it's something that has always been influenced by Maya Angelou, has been that people will remember how you made them feel when they were at their lowest than what you did. And so for all of us as leaders in business, in government, wherever we are, how we treat each other during this time, people will remember that more than anything else that will ever happen, because we are going to get through this, whether it takes us a year or 2 years or whatever. And when we look back, people will remember how we made them feel. And therefore, it's part of emotional intelligence to think about those issues.
Thank you so much, Nenita. Thank you so much. Said a mouthful there. And then just coming to you, Dr. D, I mean, how then can you advise emotional intelligence to be applied for personal growth and leadership effectiveness during this difficult and uncertain times of COVID-19? I think it's also easy just to only point the fingers at, the decision makers, be it law enforcement, be it government leaders, be it, organizational leaders, but these are also human beings. And I read an article of someone who said that, everyone is figuring it out as they go. Everyone is figuring it out as they go. But how do you then, sort of apply emotional intelligence for your personal growth and for effective leadership?
Yeah, I just want to say that I absolutely agree with what Nenita said as being the most important thing. When we go out of this, and we will, one of the characteristics of emotional intelligence is having a realistic optimism. Because if you believe that there's going to be a different kind of outcome in the future, some light at the end of the tunnel that isn't the same as an oncoming train, you start behaving in a way that might generate that difference. If you don't believe in that, you create a self-fulfilling prophecy, which means you just give up. So your beliefs create your actions, and your actions create your results. And those are some of the things that come to pass in the end. So that optimism that Nenita spoke about, I think is exceptionally important, and it's different from positivity. It's not just saying think positively, which sometimes makes people feel ashamed of their negative thoughts. And the fact that all feelings are acceptable. There are no feelings that are unacceptable. Fear is acceptable. Anger is acceptable. It's how we deal with them. And so how do we deal with them? We recognize them. We name them so that we can respond instead of react. You can think when you do that, instead of these feelings building up and overwhelming you. That's when those stress reactions really take over and you start acting out. So that's the first step. And then in terms of we are going to leave here, hopefully, as more compassionate members of the human race. That kind of awareness of nothing joins people more than a shared emotional event. We've seen it so often positively in the country. Even when we won the World Cup or through the transition, how suddenly that connection comes together. We're seeing it now too, because, we say we're not all in the same boat, but it's the same storm that is affecting everybody differently. And so, my wish, there's so many things about emotional intelligence, but I want to just underscore what Nenita said about the importance and the power of kindness, of acknowledgement, of connection, the fact that we are wired for connection, and that it starts at wherever you are. and we can leave a little bit differently perhaps than the way we came in.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Dr. D. And Dr. Stempile, I suppose this one, as a closing comment, will be in conjunction with a question here by Precious as well. It's a bit more personal. And I suppose, you know, just your advice, you know, on anyone who may be going through these emotions. Precious says, then how can one be in the moment? You know, being in the moment, being in the here, the now, when there's so much uncertainty around employment, mental, physical well-being, around the pandemic itself. You know, you're thinking about your future, whether you can pay your car next month, your house, your kids' school fees, whether or not you'll be able to put food on the table for next month. How would you advise just applying that emotional intelligence just to live in the now?
Look, at the risk of sounding like Oprah or something, I have found for myself and you know, with the work that I'm doing with students, is that developing some kind of mindfulness practice is so important. So to get your brain, to basically train your brain to be still, to take some time out from the madness of everything that is going around us. And that is a matter of training your brain. Often it's very difficult for us to do naturally, but to take that 5 minutes to meditate or to pray or to journal, and to just be with yourself, to be with your thoughts, and to just settle your mind and to have everything that's going, you know, the thing about meditation is that it's not that you're not now going to stop thinking, you're going to think, but it's that you think and you don't judge your thoughts, you don't get caught up in the story of your thoughts, you just acknowledge that they are there. And that developing that kind of practice, making some time for yourself every day to just be still, regardless of whatever else is going on in your life, at least creates it expands, it creates an expansion in your life in terms of the amount of time that you have to address the real problems that you're then facing in your life. But what it also does is that it helps you to put things into perspective, and to have some distance from the things that make you so anxious. And the most important thing is that it gives you something that you feel you're in control of. And in a time that we're all feeling so out of control, having those routines and those practices is such a gift that we give to ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think that also with the work that you do with, you know, students and working alongside other lecturers, it still applies, because students are, I can imagine, uncertain about whether they'll still reach their academic potential, you know, whether they will still be employable. With the advent of COVID, if the courses they're partaking in now will be relevant, or it will be, you know, job, it's not future proof, you know, for a job which you can be just assured that it will be secured. So that advice definitely sound for students as well as, you know, the lecturers, which are your counterparts. But thank you so much, Dr. Stempile Mbete. Thank you so much for your input, as well as yourself, Dr. D. I appreciate all your inputs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks to me.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. With that being said, before we say goodbye as well to, you know, our participants, I'd like to invite back Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe just to close off for us as well, based on, you know, the engagements that we've had from our panelists, as well as, you know, the questions that were quite, you know, informed questions. So some were very personal, but I think we can all, you know, relate to at least one or two that came up. And I also saw, you know, our panelists just engaging with them within the chat, giving of, you know, that support system in terms of numbers or websites which you can contact. Thank you so much for also doing that, simultaneously answering right here through the webinar. I'd just like to invite back Dr. Precious Moloi-Motsepe just to give us then a roundup and closing off of our webinar.
Dumelo, thank you so much. You were absolutely amazing again. And our panel, Dr. D and Dr. Stempile and my dear sister Nolita, thank you. You were all amazing. Just from my perspective, I just want to also just end with what Dr. Stempile was saying about meditation. It's something that I practice twice a day. I've got a very noisy brain, but I do sit down and actually try and connect with my maker. The other important thing that we must remember is to always be grateful for what we have. the little things that you have, just being here today, having this beautiful, beautiful day, it's something to be thankful for. Your health, your parents, your friends, those are the things we need to say thank you for. And that helps us to cope with the challenges that we all have. And just last 2 points, I want to thank the panel for honing in on coping strategies and also making it possible for us to open ourselves and be vulnerable. And we saw that right here when Stembile said, I don't know how to answer that question. She allowed herself to be vulnerable. And it's okay. It's okay. So vulnerability, which all of our panel members spoke about, has become, as Nolita said, one of the most important skills that we will need going into this era of the fourth industrial revolution. And lastly, I want to challenge all the men who were asking questions and who were part of our audience. If there is enough interest, Tumelo, I think having heard what I think one of the panel members said about men and their coping strategies and their difficulty in actually connecting with their emotions, it might be useful and worthwhile for us to have a webinar where people can just be able to talk without being identified. And you know, otherwise we have all those referral centers which you mentioned, which I would encourage everybody to get in touch with. But at the end of the day, I just want to say thank you very much. This was a very important conversation, and I think the panel and our facilitator handled it very well. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to everyone who participated. We appreciate it, and we'll see you again, of course, in our next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a brilliant and beautiful Wednesday. Afternoon.
Thanks,
Friday.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.